My husband caught me having an affair with his best friend, so he destroyed my business and took everything from me. Now I'm forced to work with my ex to survive, and he's relentless. My name is Lisa, 32F, and I'm not proud of what I've done. I've been married to David, 34M, for nearly 8 years, and for the longest time, I believed we were in a good place. But a few years into our marriage, things began to shift. David grew distant, consumed by his job, and our once passionate relationship felt more like a transactional partnership than a marriage. I was lonely, frustrated, and started seeking attention elsewhere. It was selfish, but I didn't want to feel invisible anymore. Enter Mike, 33M, David's best friend since college. He was charming, attentive, and had this way of making me feel seen again. What started as friendly conversations turned into late-night texts, which then turned into something I can't undo. We had an affair that lasted for nearly a year, carefully hidden in the shadows. I knew it was wrong, but I justified it, convincing myself that David had given up on us, that he didn't care anymore. But as I should have known, secrets like ours don't stay buried forever. One night, David came home unexpectedly early from a business trip. I was in bed with Mike. The look on David's face when he walked into our bedroom is something I'll never forget. His eyes widened, his face turned red, and his hands clenched into fists. I jumped out of bed, trying to explain, but the words stuck in my throat. I watched as he looked from me to his best friend, betrayal evident in his expression. He didn't say a word. He just walked out. After that night, everything fell apart. David's silence was worse than any yelling match we could have had. He wouldn't answer my calls or respond to my texts. I felt trapped in a cage of my own making, suffocated by guilt and shame. I lost Mike too. He stopped responding to me after that night, probably out of fear of what David would do. I was completely alone, left to pick up the shattered pieces of my marriage and my life. But David wasn't done with me yet. One week after discovering the affair, I came home to find our house empty. All of my belongings were packed into boxes on the lawn. He had changed the locks, and there was a note taped to the door. "I've taken everything. Good luck." My heart sank as I read those words, the finality of it all crushing me. He'd filed for divorce and was coming after me with everything he had. It wasn't just the house either. David also went after my business. I'd started a small boutique shop a few years back, and it was finally beginning to turn a profit. But David knew people who could ruin me. He leveraged his connections, and before I knew it, vendors started dropping their contracts. Customers stopped coming, and my reputation was in tatters. He pulled every string he could find, and within a month, I was forced to close the shop. My dream was gone, destroyed by my own recklessness and his cold vengeance. Desperate, and with no income, I turned to the one person who I thought might help me rebuild. My ex-husband, Aaron, 37M. Aaron and I had parted on amicable terms, and he had always been the steady, reliable type. He had a successful landscaping business, and despite our history, he agreed to let me work for him. It wasn't ideal, but I had no other options. I was starting over, and it felt like I was paying for my mistakes every single day. But working with Aaron wasn't the relief I thought it would be. He had changed over the years. He was harder, more driven, and far less forgiving. He knew about my affair with David's best friend, and he wasn't shy about reminding me of it. He'd make offhand comments, cruel little digs that cut deeper than I expected. It was clear that he saw me as nothing more than a liability, someone he could exploit for his own benefit. And honestly, I couldn't blame him. Aaron was relentless in his demands. He'd call me at all hours, making me work weekends, giving me the dirtiest, most grueling jobs. I'd show up to sites covered in mud, my hands blistered, and my back aching. He seemed to take pleasure in watching me struggle, relishing in the power he now held over me. I could see it in his eyes. He was enjoying every moment of my downfall. I tried to keep my head down and push through, but the resentment was building. I'd sacrificed everything: my marriage, my business, my self-respect. And for what? For a man who didn't care about me, and a job that barely allowed me to survive. I had hit rock bottom, and every day felt like a new level of hell. I was trapped in a cycle of shame, regret, and bitterness, and there seemed to be no way out. But little did I know, this was only the beginning of my punishment. The weeks working under Aaron turned into months. I'd become a shell of the person I used to be, dragging myself through each day just to survive. Aaron continued to push me to my breaking point, assigning me tasks I wasn't trained for, knowing it would take twice as long for me to complete them. He was relentless, almost as if he took pleasure in watching me struggle. And though I knew he was punishing me, I felt like I deserved every bit of it. I had thrown away everything, after all. One day, as I was halfway through clearing a garden bed in a wealthy client's yard, Aaron walked over to me, a smug look on his face. "You know, Lisa, I always thought you'd end up right back here," he sneered. "Maybe not this exact job, but you. Broken, desperate, willing to do whatever it takes just to get by." I saw it coming. His words cut deep, but I bit my tongue, focusing on the shovel in my hand, pushing it deeper into the dirt. I had nothing left to defend. I was nothing more than a shadow, doing the grunt work of a business I used to scoff at. There was no escape from the bitter reality I'd built for myself. Over the next few weeks, Aaron became bolder, almost crueler in his attempts to make me feel like a failure. He'd give me tasks that required two people but insisted I do them alone. He'd take away the lunch breaks I was supposed to have and dock my pay for the smallest of mistakes. I was exhausted mentally and physically, but I couldn't afford to leave. I had no money, no options, and nowhere else to turn. One day, Aaron dropped a bombshell on me. He casually mentioned that he'd run into David, and they'd had a few beers together. My heart stopped. I hadn't seen or heard from David since the divorce proceedings, and the idea of him and Aaron discussing me made me feel sick. He'd asked how you were doing, Lisa, Aaron said with a smirk, leaning against his truck, as if he were talking about the weather. I told him you're exactly where you deserve to be. He laughed, said he couldn't agree more. The humiliation hit me like a punch in the gut. They were gloating over my misery, finding satisfaction in the ruins of my life. It was the final confirmation that I had become a joke, a source of twisted amusement for the men who once played central roles in my life. Aaron seemed to revel in it, delighting in the fact that he had the power to remind me of my downfall whenever he pleased. I tried to focus on my work, but I couldn't shake the images that flooded my mind, of Aaron and David laughing at my expense, of the whispers and rumors that must have spread through our small town. I was the woman who had destroyed her own marriage, betrayed her husband, and was now crawling back to an ex who treated her like dirt. The shame was suffocating, but I had no one to turn to, no allies, no friends. I had burned every bridge in my path. As if the universe wasn't done with me yet, I started getting messages from a number I didn't recognize. They began innocently enough, just a few strange texts here and there, but soon they turned dark. It was David's mistress, the woman he'd left me for, the one who had been his escape while I was spiraling in my own betrayal. She taunted me, mocking the way I'd fallen, accusing me of things I hadn't even done. She called me a leech, a parasite living off the remnants of a life I no longer deserved. "I've seen your pathetic attempts to move on," one text read. "David and I are thriving. We have everything. You're nothing. Just a joke we tell over drinks." The messages kept coming, growing more venomous by the day. It was as if everyone in my life had decided to unite in tormenting me. Each text felt like a slap, a reminder of how far I've fallen, and worst of all, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe they were right. Maybe I did deserve this. Maybe this was my punishment for everything I'd done. One day, after an especially grueling day of work, I sat in my car, exhausted and broken. I was about to start the engine when my phone buzzed with a message that made my blood run cold. "You think you're safe with Aaron? You think he cares? He's just using you to get back at David. They both think you're pathetic. You're nothing but a pawn in their little game." My hands trembled as I read the words. The weight of everything came crashing down on me. I realized that I'd allowed myself to be manipulated, to be used by men who saw me as nothing more than a means to an end. David had taken everything, and Aaron was using my desperation to his advantage. I had no real allies, no one who truly cared. I was alone, stuck in a cycle of punishment that I couldn't escape. I sat there in the dark, the anger bubbling up inside me. I thought of all the ways they humiliated me, of how I'd become the punchline to a cruel joke. My mind raced with thoughts of revenge, of ways I could turn the tables, expose them for what they'd done to me. But then the hopelessness returned, suffocating any spark of defiance. I was trapped, bound by my own mistakes, forced to live in the shadow of my shattered life. In that moment, I realized that I had only two options. continue to let them control me, or find a way to break free, even if it meant starting over from nothing. I had no idea how I'd do it, but I knew I couldn't live like this any longer. I had to reclaim some part of myself, even if it was the last thing I did. As I drove away that night, a seed of resolve took root. I would find a way to escape this nightmare, no matter the cost. They might have taken everything, but I still had one thing left: my will to survive. The next morning, I arrived at the job site with a newfound determination, though I was still battered and emotionally drained. Aaron noticed my quiet demeanor, and of course, he couldn't resist throwing another jab my way. "Rough night," he sneered, barely looking up from his phone. "Or were you just realizing how lucky you are to even have this job?" I ignored him, focusing on the task at hand. Every time he opened his mouth, it was like fuel to the fire that had been growing inside me. I knew I needed to get away from him, from this toxic situation. But first, I needed a plan, and I needed leverage. As the days dragged on, I started keeping a journal of every demeaning thing Aaron said to me, every task that was unreasonable, every time he manipulated my hours. It felt like I was clawing back some sense of control. I wasn't entirely sure how I'd use it yet, but I knew that knowledge was power. I'd let people use my mistakes against me for too long. Now it was time for me to start fighting back. Then, as if the universe wanted to test my patience even further, I overheard Aaron on the phone with David one afternoon. They hadn't noticed I was nearby, busy cleaning up debris behind a hedge, hidden from sight. "Yeah, she's still here, working herself to the bone. I almost feel bad for her, man," Aaron laughed, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "But not enough to stop. I figure if she's gonna be miserable, I might as well get some use out of her, right?" He laughed again, and I felt my hands clench, my nails digging into my palms. Aaron was toying with me, and David was in on it too. I'd been reduced to a pawn, something they could exploit for their twisted amusement. They thought they'd broken me, that I was too far gone to ever fight back. But listening to them laugh about me, their disdain so casual and dismissive, lit a fire I hadn't felt in months. I decided then that I needed more than just a record of Aaron's cruelty. I needed something solid, something that would put him and David in their place. I started watching Aaron more closely, noticing his patterns, keeping track of his comings and goings. He was careless, assuming I was too wrapped up in my own misery to pay attention to what he was doing. One night, after everyone else had left the job site, I stayed behind, pretending to finish up some work. I knew Aaron often left things lying around, and I was determined to find anything that could help me take control. I searched his office, my hands trembling as I rifled through drawers, looking for anything that could serve as ammunition. It was a long shot, but I was desperate. And then I found it, a folder buried under a stack of invoices. Inside were documents detailing illegal subcontractor deals, under-the-table payments, and cut corners on various projects. I couldn't believe my luck. Aaron had been skimming off the top, taking kickbacks, and cheating clients for years. He was so arrogant that he hadn't even bothered to hide the evidence. I took photos of everything, my heart pounding with excitement and fear. With this, I could destroy Aaron's business, maybe even put him behind bars. He'd been treating me like dirt, using my past against me, but now I had something far more damaging against him. I slipped the folder back where I found it, and left, clutching my phone like it was a lifeline. But I wasn't done yet. I still had David to deal with, and I wanted to see him suffer just as much. Aaron's shady business deals would ruin him, but David had to pay for the way he'd torn my life apart. I spent the next few days gathering anything I could find that would implicate him too. Social media posts, bank statements, anything that hinted at his involvement in Aaron's schemes. It was like peeling back layers of rot, revealing just how deep their corruption went. One evening, as I was sitting in my dingy apartment, reviewing everything I found, my phone buzzed with another message from David's mistress. Her taunts had become almost routine at this point, but this time, the message was different. "Hope you're happy with yourself. I talked to Aaron. He said you've been snooping around. We both know you can't afford to play hero. You're still the loser you always were." My blood ran cold. They knew. Aaron had caught on, and he'd tipped off David. Panic seized me, and for a moment, I felt like the walls were closing in. But then, something inside me snapped. They thought I was weak, that I was helpless, but I wasn't the same person I'd been when this all started. I wasn't about to let them win. I replied to her message with a single line, "I have enough evidence to ruin you both." A few minutes later, my phone rang. It was David. I didn't answer. He called again and again and eventually left a voicemail, his voice a mixture of anger and desperation. He told me I had no right, that I'd regret crossing him. But I didn't care. For the first time in a long time, I felt powerful. The next morning, I made my way to Aaron's office, holding my head high. He looked up as I walked in, his face a mask of contempt. I didn't give him a chance to speak. I dropped my phone on his desk, showing him the photos of his illegal dealings. "I know everything, Aaron," I said, my voice steady. "You've been using me, but I'm not as helpless as you think. If you don't want this going public, you'll leave me alone. And you'll make sure David does too." He blanched, his smirk disappearing as he looked down at the evidence. For a moment, I could see the panic in his eyes, the realization that he'd underestimated me. I felt a surge of satisfaction, a rush of triumph as I watched him squirm. For the first time, he had nothing to say, no snide remarks, no cutting insults. Just silence. I turned and walked out, feeling a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in years. They thought they could use me, destroy me, but I'd taken back control. I didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time, I was ready to face whatever came my way. I'd been broken, humiliated, and left with nothing, but now I had the one thing that mattered, my power. I returned home that day feeling like I'd just won a war, but I knew better than to relax. The moment I walked into my apartment, my phone buzzed again. It was David. His messages had gone from threats to pleas, alternating between anger and desperation. He was trying to manipulate me, but I was done playing his games. I ignored him, letting his messages pile up as I focused on my next move. The following morning, I found a letter slipped under my door. It was a formal-looking envelope, no return address, but as soon as I opened it, my stomach twisted. It was a cease and desist notice, signed by David's lawyer. They were threatening to sue me for defamation if I went public with anything I found. I scoffed. They thought a legal threat would scare me off. They had no idea who they were dealing with now. I spent the next few days consulting with a lawyer of my own. I'd been smart enough to document everything. Aaron's illegal dealings, the messages from David, the threats, and even the cease and desist letter. My lawyer assured me I had a solid case if they tried to take it to court. In fact, if they pushed too hard, it could end up blowing back on them even worse. I was covered, and that knowledge filled me with a renewed sense of confidence. Meanwhile, David's mistress continued to taunt me, claiming that my little power play was pathetic. She bragged about the life she and David were building, about how he'd never really loved me. She was so brazen, so vile, that I almost found myself laughing. They were so wrapped up in their own world of lies and manipulation, they didn't realize I'd already dismantled their foundation. I knew I couldn't keep dragging this on indefinitely, though. I needed an endgame, something that would put David and Aaron in their place for good. That's when I decided to go public. I had enough dirt on both of them to create a scandal that would shake our community. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about exposing the truth and making sure no one else fell victim to their schemes. The night before I planned to release everything, I got another call from David. This time, I answered. He sounded different, his usual arrogance replaced by a thinly veiled panic. "Look, we don't have to do this," he began, trying to keep his voice calm. "Let's settle this privately. I'll give you a payout, whatever you want, just keep your mouth shut." I let him talk, enjoying his desperation. It was pathetic, really, watching a man who'd once tried to break me, groveling for mercy. I didn't say a word, just listened to him stumble over himself, offering me money, empty promises, anything he thought would make me back down. When he was done, I finally spoke. "You stole everything from me, David. My trust, my dignity, my business. And you think you can just buy your way out of this. You have no idea what I've been through because of you. But tomorrow the world will." I hung up before he could respond, savoring the silence that followed. It was over. I wasn't just reclaiming my life. I was tearing down his. The next morning, I released everything online. I timed it perfectly, dropping the story to a few local news outlets and posting the documents publicly. Within hours, the story went viral. People were outraged, and the backlash was swift. Aaron's business deals, David's manipulation, everything was out in the open. I watched with satisfaction as the two men who tried to destroy me found themselves trapped in the same web they'd spun. As the days passed, I received countless messages of support from people I hadn't spoken to in years. Even old friends, people who had distanced themselves when my life had fallen apart, reached out to express their sympathy, their anger on my behalf. It was surreal, the sudden shift from isolation to solidarity. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't alone in this fight. But it wasn't all good news. Aaron and David were going down without a fight. I started receiving threatening letters, phone calls in the middle of the night, and veiled messages warning me to back off. They were desperate, and desperation made them dangerous. I knew I had to be careful. I couldn't let my guard down, not yet. One evening, I came home to find my apartment door slightly ajar. My heart raced as I stepped inside, my mind immediately jumping to the worst-case scenario. I moved cautiously, checking each room, but nothing seemed out of place. Then, I noticed a note on my bed. It was handwritten, a single line scrawled in a familiar, spiteful script. "This isn't over." I felt a chill run down my spine. They were getting bolder, trying to intimidate me into silence. But I wasn't afraid. I'd come too far to back down now. If they wanted a fight, I was ready to give them one. Over the next few weeks, the fallout from my revelations continued to spread. Aaron's business was investigated, his contracts canceled, and he faced legal consequences for his illegal dealings. David's reputation was in tatters, his personal and professional life unraveling before his eyes. They'd underestimated me, thought I was weak, but I'd proven them wrong. One day, I received a final message from David. It was short, almost pleading. "Let's talk. Please." I deleted it without a second thought. I didn't need to hear his excuses, his justifications. I'd taken back my life, and he had no place in it anymore. I knew there would be no happy ending, no clean resolution. The scars of what they'd done would linger, a reminder of the pain I'd endured. But I was free, finally free, and that was enough. After everything I discovered, I knew I had to play my final card. David and Aaron thought they could manipulate me, use me, and toss me aside like I was nothing. But this time, I had the upper hand. I'd gathered all the evidence and I was ready to unleash it. I spent the next few days preparing my strategy. First, I went public with the story of my downfall. I shared everything: how David had used his connections to destroy my business, how Aaron had exploited my desperation for his own benefit, and how they both seemed to enjoy dragging me through the mud. I didn't hold back any details, making sure to paint a vivid picture of the twisted games they'd played. The story spread like wildfire. Friends and acquaintances reached out, some expressing sympathy, others offering apologies for believing the rumors. But I wasn't interested in their pity. I wanted justice. I wanted them to feel the weight of their actions, to watch as everything they'd built crumbled around them. The fallout was swift. David lost his job, his boss wanting nothing to do with the scandal that had tainted his reputation. His colleagues, who'd once admired him, now whispered behind his back, sharing tales of his betrayal. Aaron, on the other hand, faced legal action as clients began to scrutinize his business dealings. The contracts he'd carefully secured started to slip through his fingers, one by one. But that wasn't enough. I wasn't satisfied until I knew they felt the same helplessness I'd endured. David showed up at my door one night, drunk and desperate. He pounded on the door, yelling for me to let him in to talk to him. I opened the door just a crack, enough to see the pitiful sight of the man who had once been my husband, reduced to a broken shell. He begged me to call off the scandal, to stop spreading the story. He swore he was sorry, that he'd made a mistake, and that he wanted to make things right. I looked him straight in the eyes and laughed. "You took everything from me, David. You destroyed my business, my reputation, and now you're here, asking for my forgiveness. You're not even worth my hate." I slammed the door in his face, listening to the sounds of his sobs as he staggered away. I felt a strange sense of closure, knowing he was finally experiencing the same humiliation he'd inflicted on me. A few days later, Aaron tried to confront me at work. He stormed into the job site, demanding to know why I'd betrayed him. He accused me of being ungrateful, of ruining everything he'd built, and even tried to claim that he'd been helping me out of the kindness of his heart. I stood there, letting him rant, watching as he unraveled. When he finally ran out of steam, I handed him a copy of the evidence I'd gathered, the shady business deals, the kickbacks, everything that could put him behind bars. You used me, Aaron, just like David did. But the difference is you won't get away with it. I've already sent copies to your clients, your partners, and the authorities. Your time's up. His face went pale, his brow ended up disappearing as the weight of my words sank in. He stammered, trying to backtrack, but I didn't give him the chance. I turned my back on him, walking away with the satisfaction of knowing that he'd finally been exposed. The weeks that followed were a blur. Both men were effectively ruined. David moved out of town, unable to face the humiliation that had become his life. Aaron's business went bankrupt, his reputation destroyed beyond repair. I'd heard through the grapevine that he'd been forced to sell everything, that he was barely scraping by. The same man who had relished my suffering was now drowning in his own. As for me, I decided to rebuild my life, far away from the shadows of my past. I started fresh, working for a nonprofit that helped women reclaim their lives after devastating experiences. I found purpose in my work, channeling my pain into something meaningful. I may have lost everything, but in the end, I gained something far more valuable, my freedom. And while I knew the scars of what they'd done would always remain, I was finally free from their control. They thought they could break me, but in the end, I was the one who emerged stronger. As I closed this chapter of my life, I realized that revenge might not bring true happiness, but it had brought me something almost as powerful: closure. I had taken back my power, and no one would ever take it from me again.